of introducing Dr. Wynia. So Matt Wynia is a board-certified internal medicine and infectious diseases. He's just brilliant. I'm not going to read this like 10-page essay, but he's an expert in both ethics as well as the Holocaust. And
disclosures. I do have these two disclosures to get started. I first got interested in this area of history of medicine when I was working at the American Medical Association like 15 years ago, maybe even 20 years ago. The U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum was putting together a special exhibit called Deadly Medicine, Creating the Master Race, about the medical involvement in the Nazism and the Holocaust. And I was struck at the time by how this history actually influences sort of all of the ways that we think about issues in medical ethics today are influenced by this history, and yet we hardly ever talk about it. We talk about it only really in the context of research ethics. And you can make a pretty good argument that this history actually had much less influence on research ethics than it did on all these other domains of medical ethics. So, fast forward another 20 years, and I was invited to serve on the Lancet Commission. I put these up mainly to say I'm not speaking for either of these, but this talk is heavily influenced by the work that I did with the Lancet Commission in the last couple of years. The Lancet Commission was people from all over the world, medical historians primarily. And one of the things that we really wanted to encourage is that students would get this history relatively early on in the curriculum as a way of sort of understanding how did we get to where we are today, right? How did we end up with the ethics of medicine as they stand in 2025? Because they're in some ways very different from the ethics we have had over the years. And of course, this history is a point in time when our ethics were profoundly challenged and we failed to uphold our ethics. So what happened, right? Can we use this as a learning opportunity in the way that we learn from medical errors at the level of individual patients in the hospital, right? If there's an error in the hospital, we do a root cause analysis, we dig in, we try not to blame individuals, we look at the structures and the systems and so on. Can we do the same thing using medical history to inform our understanding of how we got to the ethics that we have today and why it's important to uphold those when they're challenged? The other thing, so that's part of what the background to this. The other thing that's part of the background to this is the Lancet Commission really focuses on what happened in Germany. And you guys have already had a talk from me that you presumably watched online about what happened in Germany. So I'm going to be relatively quick about what happened in Germany. The other part of the Lancet Commission's recommendations about teaching this material, though, is every country in the world has a history around this legacy. And when we teach this, we should talk about how it resonated within our own context, within our own country. So that's really what I'm going to focus on today. So I'll focus a little today on concepts of power and hierarchy and how those can lead to ethical errors. The one thing I would add to one of the slides that Rita put up is the concept of hubris, because that's going to come up as we talk today. The concept that we are really good at what we do, and we get better all the time. And this has been true for about 150 years since the scientific revolution. Right? And that transformed what it means to be a doctor. It transformed us in many ways into scientists. And scientists are interested in data and numbers and the production of new knowledge, the industrialized production of new knowledge. And that has influenced the culture of medicine in ways that can be dehumanizing for patients. So that's going to be an underlying theme as we go through these slides today. So just a few of the slides that you have seen before, just as background here. You all know, because I presume everyone's probably watched that other talk probably twice or three times because it's so interesting, that the German medical community in the pre-war era was not backwards. They were not set up to fail in the way that you might imagine. In almost every domain, pre-war German medicine was at the pinnacle of world's medicine, right? This is a picture of the world's first electron microscope by Siemens, invented in Germany. In the 10 years leading up to the Second World War, German-speaking scientists won 6 of the 10 Nobel Prizes in physiology or medicine. Germany was at the top of the heap. Germany was also at the top of the heap in regard to public health and epidemiology. They described smoking as a cause of lung cancer. They coined the term secondhand smoke and recognized that secondhand smoke was a health hazard. That's why they banned smoking in public offices in Nazi Germany. And ironically, because of the heinous nature of the medical experimentation they did, they were also the world's leaders in medical ethics around human subjects research. When the Nuremberg trial took place, the prosecutors went looking for examples of medical regulations around human subjects research, and they found only 2 examples. Both were German. Germany was the only place that had a national code in law that governed human subjects research. In the US, we had nothing like that. So the question is, how do you go from a professional community of such enormous stature and end up with leading figures from that medical community in the dock at Nuremberg? And I think, you know, this is a copy of a slide that you, again, have seen before. I'm going to go into this a little bit, and I'm going to go into it from an American perspective, but I always have to start this talk with these disclaimers. I am talking right now, and I will be for the next 30 minutes, about some incredibly contentious issues. And I am not German, and I'm not Jewish, and I know there are people for whom this history is incredibly personal, incredibly painful. I can't take that away. But I also want to convey to you that I think all of us need to own this history. This is the history of our medical profession. This is the history that got us to where we are today. So all of us have to own this, even if we are not German, even if we are not Jewish. The second thing I always disclaim is that I find it incredibly hard to learn from monsters. I find it incredibly easy to separate myself from monsters and find all the ways in which they are different from me and how I would never do what they did. But more than half of doctors in Germany voluntarily joined the Nazi Party. Higher than any other professional group, higher than teachers, higher than engineers, higher than lawyers. Why, right? That question, I think, has to be at the front of our minds. These were not monsters. They did monstrous things. They were human beings. They were doctors. They were like us in many ways. And so grappling with that, I think, I don't have the answer to how to learn from this history, honestly. I don't. I think it is very hard. But I think we have to try. And the third thing I want to talk about is why I am focusing today on the perpetrators. Most Holocaust remembrance is about the victims. Most Holocaust remembrance is about commemorating and memorializing and saying never again, because you empathize with the victims. And I am not going to help you empathize with victims too much today. And the reason for that is because we're talking today about power and hierarchy, right? We're not talking about getting you to feel like you're a victim. We're asking you to question, could I have become one of those perpetrators? And what would be the warning signs? What's the pathway? This is a very famous quote from the Nuremberg medical trial. Andrew Ivy was the medical ethics expert sent to the Nuremberg trial by the American Medical Association. And he said something that really is haunting because it is about this question of power. He said, had the profession stood up, had the profession actually defended its core ethics, the whole idea of mass killing by factories might not have happened. And this sounds a little bit outrageous because, of course, Hitler didn't need doctors to become anti-Semitic or to kill people using bullets and so on. But as you all know, and I'll just summarize it, medical professionals were not just complicit. They weren't just cooperating, right? Medical professionals were often leaders in the worst crimes of the Nazi regime. It starts with, very early in the Nazi regime. In 1933, Hitler comes to power in January. By July, they have adopted a law for the forcible sterilization of people with a series of conditions. The vast majority of people are sterilized for what is called hereditary feeble-mindedness. This is a very elastic condition, which allows you to sterilize any number of, people, Roma and Sinti, the so-called gypsies. It allows you to sterilize people who are truants or who miss school or who are arrested for petty criminal activity, that kind of thing. This moves relatively quickly to what is now sometimes called the child euthanasia program. This is a quote from Karl Brandt. He was the chief defendant at the Nuremberg medical trial and Hitler's personal doctor. You have to take everything he says with a giant grain of salt. He lies a lot on the stand at Nuremberg. But he says that the first child who was put to death under this so-called euthanasia program was a child with severe disabilities where the parents actually called Hitler and said, could you send a team to look at the child and determine whether they should receive a mercy death? And Brandt goes down and he says, they decided that it should be done and that it should be done in such a way that the parents wouldn't feel responsible, that this decision should be a decision made by doctors, that it would be cruel to put this decision on the parents. This program evolves to this is a clandestine program of child murder. The parents are tricked. The midwives primarily, but also in this era in Germany, most children are delivered by midwives. So babies are born. If they have a severe disability, the midwife is actually paid to report that child into the central location. They have to fill out a survey about the child. If the survey suggests that the child has severe disabilities, the parents get a letter asking them to send their child for special treatment. The special treatment is not special treatment. They are either starved to death or sometimes killed with direct injection of phenol to the heart. The parents are sent letters telling them first that the child is doing well and then that they've taken a turn for the worse. Their death certificates are falsified. So this is absolutely an illegal program under German law at the time. This is murder. So it's illegal in Germany. So it's a clandestine program, a secret program that quickly evolves into older and older children and then adults living in institutional facilities throughout Germany. So what starts as hierarchies of worth and decisions about who deserves to have children and who doesn't evolves rather quickly into programs of mass murder. The first mass murder program of the Nazis is the child euthanasia program. About 10,000 children are killed in this program. The T4 program, which you've heard of, arises out of the child euthanasia program and has a very similar strategy. People with disabilities are moved from their institutional settings to these centralized facilities where they arrive. They're sent into what looks like a shower, but it is not a shower. It is in fact a gas chamber. They're killed in the gas chamber. Their dental gold is removed. Their brains are usually taken for autopsy and study because these are people with disabilities. And so they are believed to have a scientific interest. Those brains go to universities across Germany for study. Some of them are still being discovered today, by the way. The bodies are then burned in specially designed crematory ovens. This program is obviously, it precedes the Shoah itself, the Holocaust, by a couple of years. So it is a model for how the industrialized murder of European Jews will take place in the subsequent years. And it is connected as well through what's called the 14F13 program. In 1941, Hitler is a dictator running a terror state at war. So he has enormous power, but he still is very concerned about public opinion. And so he personally calls a halt to this secret program because it has become not so secret. And I'll say more about that in a moment. But there are protests arising around this program, especially from the church within Germany, but also outside of Germany. And so he halts this program, which puts about 100 people who are inured to the killing process, who are many of them medical professionals who understand the killing process, and who are capable of keeping a secret, right? They've been operating in this clandestine program for a couple of years. Those 100 people roughly are now out of work. They get transferred to Poland to establish what are called the Reinhardt camps. This is Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka. The first commandant at Treblinka is Dr. Imfrid Eberl, who is one of the T4 doctors, for example. Treblinka, if you are not familiar with the World War II history, that is the killing center where the Jews of the Warsaw Ghetto are exterminated. So 900,000 people are killed at Treblinka. Of course, in the context of what's happening here, you are creating these unregulated spaces. You're creating the opportunity for doctors to do research on human beings who have no value and who are going to die anyways. And so you see heinous experiments arising. But these experiments are not all scientifically unsound. They are rigorous. They are completely unethical, but they are rigorous. We still use the data from these experiments, and we can talk more about that if you'd like. But if you've ever put on a life jacket, those orange life jackets that has the little orange flap back here to keep your head out of the water, that's the Dachau experiments. So the data from these studies is valid. The science is morally wrong, right? And these are spaces that are sometimes called unregulated spaces. By the way, the Nazis recognized this, and they looked around the world at how other people were conducting medical research, and they thought they weren't that different from what everyone else was doing. The other thing that you are probably familiar with is ramp duty. This is the role of health professionals, not just doctors, but pharmacists and nurses were involved in ramp duty as well. This is where trains were coming in to Auschwitz from around Europe, and people would be separated out into those destined to go straight to the gas chambers, the vast majority, or those who will go to work or for medical experimentation or other purposes. So this is the story of how healers become killers, but it doesn't give you the why, right? That's what happened. And it's a horrific story. It's a terrible thing. Why? How does this actually happen? And that's what I want to dive into now, because to understand how this happens, you have to go outside of Germany and you have to go way back in history. So let me start in 375 BCE, when Plato first described what would become today known as eugenics. Eugenics is the idea of selective breeding, right? It's a very old concept. So in the Republic, this is the idealized republic of Plato's Republic. Right? The idea here is that you take the healthy, young, virile people and you have them reproduce a lot. And if they have a bad baby, you put that baby outside and let it die. And this is how you preserve the purity of the guardian's breed. So the basic idea here is, as articulated by Galton, who coined the term eugenics, that the undesirables should be got rid of and the desirables multiplied. Right? So there's positive eugenics and there's negative eugenics. Positive eugenics is a lot of what we might actually call public health today. Negative eugenics is where you deem those who are less valuable and you discourage them from reproducing. You prevent races from intermarrying because there was a very strong racial component in German and American eugenics, and the belief that interracial marriage would weaken the gene pool. And at the extreme, as happens in Germany, and to some extent in the US, those who are unworthy of living or are unworthy of reproducing are forcibly sterilized or are killed. I put on here this sort of circle because this is not just one idea. Eugenics is almost like a perfect storm of multiple historical streams coming together at the same time, right? So you have the rediscovery of Mendelian genetics, a very simplified form of genetics. You've got the ideas of Darwin, which creates the ideas that, societies, social Darwinism, right? You've got the actual coining of the term eugenics by a guy who was, he was most famous for counting everything. Anything you can count, you should count. He counted the number of steps that it took for him to get to his office in the morning and tried different paths to see which one was best. So the idea of epidemiology and public health is also being born in this time. The idea of social medicine is being born. So this is the era of John Snow and Rudolf Virchow and, right, giants in the field. And all of these feed into this elegant concept of eugenics, which, by the way, speaking of hubris, causes medicine to start to feel like everything is within our purview. We can fix it all. Sociology, psychology, poverty, all of it is medicines to solve because we have this tool, this understanding of how we can create a stronger society. This was incredibly popular. I found this at a used bookstore in Michigan a few years ago. And it's a booklet that came out from the American Medical Association in 1913. Apparently in this era, you could look up the people in your state who would come and give talks at your church group or your school or your Chautauqua, those kinds of things. This is the page from Colorado. And I just highlighted here what you could ask people to speak on. I would say between 15 and 20% of the talks available across the country in this booklet are on eugenics. So it's a very popular topic in this era. I mentioned earlier that in the US and in Germany, eugenics takes on a racial flavor. It doesn't everywhere in the world. Eugenics and racism are not always connected. But in the US and in Germany, there is a strong focus on what people still today refer to as blood and soil. Has anyone heard that phrase before, blood and soil? So you know what this refers to, right? Blood is genetics, the purity of the blood, and soil is ownership of the land, the rightful ownership of the land by those who are superior and will use the land well. This was very commonly believed throughout the United States from our founding. In fact, if you ever want to have a fun read the Declaration of Independence. It actually talks about how our complaint with the king was that he was not allowing us to expand west fast enough, and he was not doing enough to protect us from the Indian savages. So this is about expansionism to the west and about protection from this race of lesser, right? And there's so much in American literature from that era about how the Indians don't really deserve the land that they are living on. They're not taking full advantage of it. They're savages. If we had that land, think what great use we could put it to. God wants us to have that land. This is manifest destiny, right? I'm sure you've heard that phrase before. In Germany, they have a very similar thing called Lebensraum, which is room to live. And they had a very similar concept. In fact, Hitler studied the American conquest of the West because he saw this as the model for how he and Germany would conquer the East. Unlike other, France and other colonial powers that had overseas colonies, he didn't want overseas colonies. He wanted a colonial empire in the East, a direct empire into the East. And he used the American model as his model. He literally talked about the Mississippi for us will be the Volga. And he talked about people in Eastern Europe as like the Red Indians. And who remembers the fate of the Red Indians and how the Americans had conquered and killed all of the Red Indians, and Germany would do the same to the east of Germany. So that, and I just put a few, there have been a lot written about this. So none of what I'm saying is a new thought, but historians have looked into this in considerable detail. This is, by the way, well before Hitler comes to power, well before Hitler is even an adult, right? We have people like Madison Grant, whom Hitler read his book and said it was his Bible. And you can kind of see why, because Madison Grant talks, he's an American, talks about how the Nordic people are the superior people. And you can see the sort of fingers of the Nordic people extending out into the east of Europe. And that was what he was afraid of, was that the US, and in the US, of course, he and Lothrop Stoddard both, and many others, talk about these things in very colorized terms. So they were very worried that there would be these hordes of savages were migrating in and were diluting our pure race, and that this was putting our entire country at risk. This leads to, in the US, a whole slew of anti-miscegenation laws, right? Laws that prevent marriage. There's 17 US states that have one-drop rule in this time frame, meaning you are Black if you have one Black descendant at any remove. The Nazis, when they come to power, actually send delegations to the US South to study our race laws, because Hitler recognized that we were the one civilized country in the world that had really taken a firm approach to racial purity, that we had instantiated this in law, whereas others had not. And that's what he wanted to do, was instantiate racial purity in law. And so they send lawyers to the US to study our laws. They look at things like, how do we define race and how do we prevent people from getting married? And they use this in a number of ways. There is a great deal of anti-Semitism in the US in this time frame. As you all probably know, there was a very famous ship full of Jewish refugees that was turned away from US shores during the war. This is a period of time in which there are explicit racial quotas in medical schools, for example. You may not know this. I just learned this in the last couple of years working on the American Medical Association's Truth and Reconciliation Task Force. Guess what the purpose of holistic admission processes was when it was first developed for Harvard in the 1920s? It was to exclude Jews. Yeah, it turns out the purpose, previously, it was just test scores. That was it. If you got the right test score, you were in. The reason they looked for holistic admissions processes, where you had to interview and you had to get letters of recommendation, was because they needed to find out if they were admitting too many Jewish people. And you wouldn't know that just by looking at test scores. And this, of course, is not just Jewish people. They also don't want to admit Black people. They also don't want to admit women. They also don't want to admit Catholics, right? So I put this very infamous quote from Yale. Milton Winternitz is a really sort of lionized figure at Yale, but he was a blatant racist when it came to medical school admissions, explicitly saying, here's how many we're going to admit every year. We have a person listening, I'm sure, to this talk today, Dr. Helen Morris, who's a great supporter of our center, who was one of the 5 Jews allowed to attend the University of Colorado School of Medicine in the 1950s. Also, she was one of the 5 women allowed in. So these kinds of things, were very common, and the rationalizations given were pretty much the same all over the world, right? Same here in the US, these sort of racial tropes about, being too interested in commercial aspects of the enterprise, or of being, immigrants who are radical and therefore untrustworthy, that kind of thing. As you all know, because this is just general American history, there was, this time frame where we really clamped down on immigration from all over the world. We, forcibly resettled many people. Forcibly resettled, that's a kind way to put it. We pushed out, massive deportations of Mexicans, many of whom were actually American citizens at the time, in this time frame in the 20s and 30s. So there's a huge wave of anti-immigrant sentiment that takes place around eugenics. It's very explicit, as I put here in this New York Times piece about preserving the racial type as it exists here today. This was the explicit goal of these acts. This is true, both in Germany and in the US. We are sort of running in parallel at this point in terms of control of reproduction. And again, even before Hitler comes to power in the US, we've got these examples of both positive and negative eugenics, right? So we have better baby competitions and fitter family competitions on the one hand. On the other hand, we have the Black Stork movie. This is a guy from Chicago who kills a child with disabilities and defends himself. He wins his case in court and then makes a movie in which he wrote the movie and starred in the movie. It's this fantastical thing from today's point of view, but he was a folk hero in his era for killing a child with disabilities. This is an image from the first of the Fitter Family contests, where they had a blinking light that showed how often people with different sort of social value scores were born. And it suggests that, people are born very often who have low social value and not very often who have high social value. So the idea here is you want that light blinking more. So we want to encourage people to have more babies who are fit and healthy, and we want to discourage or forcibly sterilize people on the other side who are, unfit, disvalued. In Germany, this turns not only into the forcible sterilization program, it also turns into laws around abortion, for example, that strongly protect against abortion if you are an Aryan. So if you're an unmarried woman in Germany and you become pregnant, you can get into this Lebensborn program run by the SS, where you get, taken to this lovely environment. And this is all to encourage German women who are Aryan to have babies even out of wedlock, because those babies are valuable to the state. At the same time that they are actually requiring abortion if you are not an Aryan woman. This program, by the way, during the war becomes very radicalized, as many programs do. It turns into a program of mass kidnappings, taking children from other countries who have Germanic features and bringing them back to Germany to raise them as Germans. In the US, of course, we have a series of sterilization laws written by this man, Harry Laughlin. Harry Laughlin's model law is what Germany uses when they adopt their law on sterilization. So they basically take what was in effect the law in California and translate it into German. And that's the German law. And that's because this is well preceding. Remember, Germany's law comes in 1933, 11 years after this book comes out, and several years after the infamous US Supreme Court decision, which allows for forcible sterilization of people explicitly because it is in the interests of public health. So this ruling, by the way, is pretty short, and it directly ties to public health rules. So the idea here is this is a medical procedure done for public health purposes. We knew this was going on in the US. And in fact, many Americans thought that Germany was doing what we ought to be doing in terms of the murder of disabled people and in terms of forcible sterilizations. Both of those were not uncontroversial. They were controversial. And there was a lot of criticism, especially of the killing of people with disabilities on religious grounds generally. But you can see by October of 1933, So this is actually 6 years before that program gets started to kill people with serious disabilities. There is a piece in the New York Times about the plan to murder people with disabilities and how they would make sure that they didn't kill anyone who was valuable to the state by ensuring that a couple doctors would have to agree to the plan to murder the person. There's a lot of what is today called scientific racism in, again, both in Germany and in the US. There's a lot of crosstalk about this so-called science. And you see this in the language used by political leaders all the time. People are called vermin, they're called rats, they're called lice, they're called, an infestation. So there's a lot of sort of medicalized language about people. And again, this shows up in the lynching literature. Maybe literature is the wrong word, shows up in newspaper articles about lynching, right? That the people being lynched are not people. In fact, one of the strands of discussion about Black people who were lynched is that they are particularly dangerous because they look like human beings, but they really aren't. So they can and this was the same kind of language that the Germans used about Jewish people. It's one of the reasons, by the way, that Jews and Black people became very tight allies throughout the civil rights era. So this idea of National Socialism as applied biology, or Germans as being doctors as being responsible for preservation of healthy hereditary elements and eradication of pathologic elements, or as Hitler himself said, Jews being the racial tuberculosis of the people, right? People as pathogens. So not just disvalue, not just low value, but actually dangerous to the rest of us. So this social hierarchy, dehumanization, danger, right? That's the path that you're seeing taken here. And this is, of course, a very well-known image of Adolf Hitler calling himself the doctor of the German people, right? So he's not the doctor of any individual. He's the doctor of the whole. So the idea of Germany as literally a body politic, literally a community that could be healthy or ill according to its genetic makeup. So let me end with contemporary implications, and you guys are going to have time to talk about more specific implications. So I'm going to just talk today about broad implications as we articulated them in the Lancet Commission report. And I want to start by just noting at the center of this is modern scientific medicine. And that's intentional, and it took me a while to get this, I have to say, because I had been giving this talk for a long time, and then I get on this Lancet Commission, and I'm with a bunch of medical historians of the Holocaust, and they are very convinced that this is a reflection of some unique features of medicine that arose in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and that exist still today. And I thought they were wrong. I thought, look at the quote I gave you from Plato. This is a function of power. This is a function of abuse of power, and abuse of power does not depend on modern scientific medicine. It depends on a power relationship and the possibility of abusing that power relationship, and that existed long before we had modern science. Well, they convinced me that in fact, this is about that, and it also required the dehumanization that occurs in modern scientific medicine. That it's the turning people from humans with an illness into bodies with a condition, and that you can draw some data from them, you can send it to a lab, you can get it back and you can treat their condition and they get better. And it really doesn't matter, right? A vaccine doesn't care what your color is or what your personal story is, or it works or it doesn't, right? Medicine generally doesn't care about your backstory. It either is going to work for you or it's not going to work for you based on physiology. Obviously, there's some exceptions to that rule. But that's the point of view, right, of modern scientific medicine. It is one in which the patient's story is devalued and data are valued. And this, they believe, and I think they're right, is a central pillar of what leads to the Nazi crimes. This leads to a couple of risks that I put on the top and a couple of unique responsibilities that I put on the bottom. So the risks are the one about power that I already mentioned, right? The notion of hubris, the idea that medicine is so good at what we do that everything else falls to the wayside because the ends will justify the means. That's risk number one. Risk number two, the Nazis show us, and our own history shows us, that our elevated ethical pronouncements are not as strong as you think they are. They can be undercut, right? We talk about empathy, we talk about compassion, we talk about altruism. And I will tell you, those ideas sound powerful. They are under attack all the time. They're directly under attack today, right? People who are compassionate and altruistic, they're weak, they're naive, they're getting taken advantage of. That's an argument that's out there right now. That is an attack on our ethics. And I think we're in a position that we could push back on that. Do we? Don't we? How do we? Those are all questions that are up for debate. But I think if we think that compassion and altruism are important, we need to start talking about that. Because that is not a widely accepted thing right now. And it certainly was not widely accepted in the 1920s and 30s. Compassion towards, people who look different from us, compassion towards people with less power, that was not a thing. In fact, those people were taking advantage of us. They were taking our resources and not giving us enough back, right? That was exactly the argument. And we failed to stand up for ourselves at that time. We failed to stand up for our values. We failed to stand up for our patients. The other piece where, the two places where I think this history and our knowledge gives us unique responsibilities, or not unique, special responsibilities. One is around racism, right? The concept of racism is fundamentally a medical concept. It's the idea that some physiologic characteristic of you matters a lot in terms of how you should be treated in society, what privileges you should get, what jobs you should be able to hold, what school you should be able to go to, right? That's what racism is. It's the idea that there's a physical trait about you, skin color, whatever, that should matter in ways that are not medical, right? So we have unique understanding of the ways in which race should or should not be used in discussions about medicine, society, etc., because we know something about what race stands for. That's part of our training, actually. What gives you your skin color? This is stuff we can talk about. So we have some unique capacity to address questions of racism because of our training. And I do want to just go back to the hubris for a second. There are also things that our training does not give us special credence on, special legitimacy to address. Making that distinction, I think, is really hard sometimes, right? Like, where do I pull my doctor card out and say, you should trust me on this, I'm a doctor? Well, and I'll give you just one quick anecdote, because I think how much time do I have? 15. Okay, I'll give you just one quick anecdote, because this came early in my career. When we first moved to Evanston, Illinois, there was a hospital just down the road from us that had a medical waste incinerator spewing medical incinerated waste into the neighborhood. And so I got involved and we shut this thing down. But it really prompted me to think about, like, I have a public health degree and I'm a doctor. is this the time to pull my doctor card when I go to the city council to talk to them about this? And I was very constrained in how I used my medical, what I testified on. Other people testified about other stuff. I tried to stick to the stuff that I thought I had special credence, that I had a special legitimacy on. And that has stuck with me. That was over 20 years ago. That has stuck with me ever since. I try very hard not to speak outside of the areas where I have some training and expertise. That will be true, as Rita said, for all of you. You will develop expertise in different areas. And your responsibility to speak up on things will depend on what your level of expertise is in those areas. And that's the other. So that gets me to this last box on human rights. Human rights law, international human rights law, largely came out, well, it existed before the Holocaust, but it came out of World War II and was dramatically buttressed. So laws of war, especially as regards medical neutrality, these are things about which we have unique responsibilities. So we are given, for example, privileged access to prisoners and detainees. Not everyone gets to see what's happening in a detention facility or a prison. Doctors, nurses, we do get to see. And so we are the check in those environments. And that gives us unique responsibility. We're also, by the way, in the military, a little bit outside the chain of command, right? Doctors do not sit in the normal chain of command like JAGs. We sit outside the normal chain of command because we are the experts on medical ethics. This came up a lot when I was at the AMA. One of the issues we had to deal with was physician engagement in force feeding and torture of prisoners, detainees at Guantanamo. And we had to, figure out how to help healthcare professionals who were trying not to get wrapped up in the torture of detainees. And these distinctions end up mattering. Like, who are you reporting to? What power do they have over you? Let me end with that, and I'll just put up a few of the references that I have found helpful. This Journal of Ethics, AMA Journal of Ethics special issue that a colleague and I co-edited in 2021 has a series of pieces in it that I think provide some good information and reflections on contemporary issues. The Lancet Commission report in particular, if you're thinking about a specific topic, abortion, medical aid in dying, we put a section in there about sort of each of those because they're complicated. This history is a lot more complex than most, as with every history, by the way. It's always more complicated than you at first think. But we've got sections in there about each of those that I find very helpful. And then the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, of course, is always a great resource. And they have the Mandel Center at the Holocaust Museum is their sort of academic center, and they will collaborate with you on anything you want to look into in this history. All right, I will stop there with a few minutes, I hope, for questions. Yes. Yeah, and just so for folks online, the question is, and by the way, by far the most popular first question. The question is, what about the use of data from these experiments that were unethically conducted? And the concern, obviously, is that you don't want to encourage people to do unethical research as long as they get really interesting results and then they get rewarded by people recognizing the value of their results for generations to come. And that is a very real concern. I will say, by the way, there are about 300 twins who were experimented on by Mengele, so 600 people. And they have been divided on this issue. And the question is, was my suffering for nothing? Or if you use these data, are you in some way validating the study that was clearly unethical to begin with? And that's the balancing act. The way the American Medical Association has addressed this is by saying, if there are no other data that you can use that would be comparable or to make the same point, then you can reference these. But when you do so, you should say within the body of the paper, not just in a footnote, you should say why you are citing to these data, that you realize they were unethically obtained information, but it's what we have today, and there's no possibility of replicating that study, right? So that's the solution. I will say, by the way, it is more complicated than that, of course, because a lot of what we learned, in these studies has just become sort of part of the atmosphere in which we live. So we don't even cite them. It's just things we know about, starvation, or things we know about ice water immersion, or things and rewarming, and things we know, right? So we don't even know that we are using these data, or wound healing, or right. Mostly these were studies about, things that might help survival, malaria experiments and dengue fever experiments, and yeah. Yes.
Give us, in your experience, you mentioned the phrase that we're kind of talking about referential power and people that defer to us as physicians. And the phrase "trust me" comes up. But I've found, particularly with my own family and peer group during COVID, for example, trust me was never
didn't work.
Undermining and actually validated their position more. How is your path to explanation, self-education, and then espousing those truths?
Yeah.
How does that work for you, and how have you found that?
Yeah. So again, for those online, the question is, during the pandemic, but also prior to the pandemic, the phrase "trust me" does not always work that well. In fact, sometimes it can backfire, because it is an assertion of authority rather than a proof of worthiness, right? So I've long said, like for 30 years, we should stop thinking about trust and spend all our time thinking about trustworthiness. And how do we show that we are worthy of trust? And then the other piece, and I think that's just a framing thing, the other piece I would refer back to something that Dr. Lee referred to, which is, being curious and not being too authoritative right off the bat, figure out where the patient is actually coming from. And when I hear someone coming from a place that doesn't make sense to me, or, I see as irrational, I try very hard not to say that. I try very hard to say, tell me more, right? And I look as best I can for a place where I can make a connection. Oh, I hear you. I can totally see how you would think that. In fact, if it's true, I will often say, I used to think something very similar, and here's what convinced me otherwise. So I try to find a way to get behind them and pull them or push them towards what I'm thinking, and just explain what I'm thinking. And I don't push people anymore, with very rare exceptions. I try to pull them. This is all judo. This is not karate, right? It is all judo. Yes.
How do we prevent history from repeating itself in terms of vilifying entities based on race, when today there's like federal agencies that are pushing that to like remigration, and how do we kind of like prevent that from happening?
Yeah. Yeah. So the question, a very challenging question, obviously, about the contemporary political environment and the fact that we are, as I alluded to, actually, we are hearing messages around, remigration, and we're hearing language that sounds, eerily familiar. It's not the same, right? I just be very clear. We're not talking about a recapitulation of history. History doesn't repeat itself, it rhymes, right? And that's kind of what we're hearing today is sort of a rhyming. And not just, by the way, in the US, this is happening in many countries around the world where people are vilifying others and dehumanizing them, portraying them as dangerous to the community, as, you know, as an infestation that we need to clear ourselves of. Very reminiscent of the language that was used around Indians, you know, Native Americans long ago, very familiar to, you know, people in Germany, very familiar to all over the world. I think our task, and this is why I sort of was trying to be clear about where do we speak up and where do we say, look, that's not my bailiwick as a doctor, right? So you may still speak up. You're a human being, you're a citizen, you should speak up about anything you want to speak up about. But where do you pull the doctor card and say, I have special credence in this domain? And I think we do have some special credence in this domain. I think there are others who also have that kind of credence, right? So people who study sociology and people who study economics can also answer some of these questions, right? Because a lot of this is now being framed around economic impacts of undocumented people and, right, all of that kind of stuff. And we don't have special knowledge there. We have special knowledge about, you know, the path to perdition lies, you know, it is paved with stone number 1 is dehumanizing language. Stone number 2 is setting, you know, these strata of social value. Stone number 3 is let's start trying to get rid of the people with low social value. And, you know, obviously it goes down from there. So I do think we've got this history, right? Something I often say is, I don't think human nature has changed all that much in the last 800 years. Maybe not 1,000 years or 2,000 or 10,000, probably not that much. Human nature is probably pretty similar to what it was in Plato's time. What we have today that we didn't have 1,000 years ago is this history. So we have to figure out how to learn from this history. Otherwise, we make no progress, right? If we can't learn from our mistakes. So I think it's legit to call on this history, even as I realize the dangers of playing the Nazi card, which are very real, right? I'll tell you, no one who gets told what they're doing looks a lot like what the Nazis did will say to you, oh, you're right. I should rethink that. That is just not what happens. So I think we have to be incredibly cautious about implying that someone else is acting like a Nazi, because it won't work to change their behavior. But we also have to be clear about the history, right? And that is a balancing act. This is a very egregious history. It is a very challenging history to understand and learn from, but we have to figure out how to learn from it. And we have to figure out how to help other people learn from it. Maybe this ties together these two questions. Like yours is at the social level and this is at the individual level. I think that may be the end. Yeah, okay. Thank you all so much.